Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Own the Shift, where our job is to give you tips, tools, and strategies to help you stop working a 12-hour shift, but truly owning your shift. My name is Jen. I'm a 14-year ER and trauma nurse, and I want to say that these videos aren't necessarily instructions, but what I've done over these 14 years to help the longevity of my career and how I've avoided the word we all hear about, which is burnout. And so in today's video, I want to dedicate it to basically anybody in healthcare because we all go through this. And today's topic is all about secondary trauma. We'll discuss what secondary trauma is, why it's important to us, how it affects it, and what are the strategies we can do to help us deal with this secondary trauma. So let's get into it. So what is secondary trauma? So secondary trauma is also called compassion fatigue, or also known as vicarious trauma. It is defined as the emotional and physical impact that healthcare workers experience when caring for patients who have experienced trauma, such as abuse, neglect, violence, or the loss of a loved one. Why am I even talking so much about this? Because why does it even affect us? Because in healthcare, we spend a significant time with our patients that deal with a ton of stress, their pain, their suffering with them and their families. They say that these symptoms that we experience can be known as anxiety, depression, emotional numbness, intrusive thoughts or memories, and difficulty sleeping. If we don't address these, it can morph into PTSD. And PTSD has been, I think, in the Journal of Emergency Medicine listed 22.3% of ER nurses experience PTSD and 20% of ICU nurses can experience PTSD. But to me, in the beginning of our careers is when the secondary trauma is at its highest. And in my last video, I kind of touched on this whole thing about the first. And the first is truly when we're seeing everything from a brand new lens and we haven't put our brain together on how we're going to organize the things that we're seeing. Oftentimes, some of the hardest parts about the first is because of the emotional story that comes in with the trauma or the violence or the patient's condition. So for instance, if a child was abused and maybe it was even by their own family member, it might feel a little more emotionally connected to us because in a normal mind, we think, oh my gosh, how could, a parent or a sister or a brother do anything like this? And so it's harder for us to process things that are truly out of the ordinary. And so with every first death that we see, every, crazy situation that walks in through the door, we just really do need to learn how to process this. And so how do we process this? So step one, we have to recognize and process your feelings. You have to acknowledge that the things that are important to you that you feel emotionally upset about are totally legit. Secondary trauma is a very real thing. The impact of the things that come in through the door and the trauma you feel can stick with you long after you've left the workplace. So this is your permission to accept what you feel and understand that's a very normal thing. I feel like in healthcare, there can be a very big elephant in the room that some people enjoy, like boasting or bragging about the things that they've seen or the things that they've come across. And remember that a lot of times, sometimes that's a way of people talking about things, and sometimes the people with the biggest egos are the people with the biggest insecurities. And so just because somebody's able to process really traumatic situations doesn't mean it's going to be the same for your feelings. So somebody that's so many years in is not going to have the same physical reaction as somebody that is just getting started. So first, accept and acknowledge that if you feel those feelings, it is okay. So number two, making sure that you find the right outlet for your emotions. And of course, we can talk about the obvious things such as like journal or draw or meditate or yoga or whatever it is, but truly finding the right outlet. So for instance, for myself, when I was getting started, I started in emergency pediatrics. And so a lot of that stuff was extremely difficult for me to process. And even though I don't have children of my own, the things that came through the door, I would really relate to my niece and nephews because some of them would be the same age of the patients that were coming in. And just thinking how horrific some of this stuff was, that these innocent kids, were going through some of the stuff that they were going through because child abuse is way more prevalent than we really understand. What I used to do is and I'm very fortunate for, our father used to be a volunteer EMT. And so he used to work on the rig. And back in his day, when he was in medicine, that truly meant you swoop the person up and you drive to the hospital. There wasn't as much advancement as there is now. So for me, on my drives home, I would get off at 7 o'clock in the morning and I would call him. I had about a 20-minute drive. And so I would just basically vomit all of my feelings. And so we would talk about it. And he did have some experience, so it was great because it was somebody that could relate to those situations and the reality of what life is. I could not do the same thing if I was talking to, let's say, my sister, who has absolutely no medical background at all. So it was a great tool to vent to him. Sometimes when I got home, it would affect my sleep. I wouldn't be able to sleep, and so I would feel the emotions that were carrying through even past my car ride. And so it started becoming a little bit of a problem in the beginning of just truly not knowing how to process. And what I did, and what really worked well for me, is I would speak to my dad on those drives home that were tough. Sometimes I would take a bath, and it was kind of like my decompress time. So it was like no longer talking anymore, and I was just decompressing and just allowing myself to be calm. And then after that, that was it. I told myself I was done. I was moving on. I said what I had to say about it. I felt what I needed to feel. Maybe if I needed to come back to it later in the day, but it was setting a timeline. So it was like, get upset, get your cry on, feel those feelings, process them, go to sleep. And then when I wake up, it's time to move on, and it's time to do number 3, self-care, which self-care I feel like is extremely evident, although important to talk about. Self-care comes in all the forms, and that another generic response of just making sure you exercise, making sure you're doing something. You have to do something for you, because if you're not doing something for you and these emotions are just constantly coming up, you're doing yourself no favor. So you have to find that outlet to get those endorphins. Go take a walk, go watch your dog at the park, go play with your cat with a laser, make them run up the wall, anything you can think of that just gets you out of the moment. You have to get out of your head. And I think what goes along with self-care and just getting your brain out of things is also learning to be nice to yourself. So if you start having those thoughts creeping in, thinking, I can't hack this, maybe I can't take this, I'm not as strong, I'm not as tough, absolutely not. You have to talk to yourself as if you were talking to a friend. So telling yourself that, yes, this is new and this is a lot to process, but I'm gonna get better as my experience continues. So being kind to yourself, recognizing that it's not a weakness to have feelings. And personally, even being 14 years into emergency medicine and still working in the hospital, there are still times that certain moments, certain scenarios, certain patient situations are going to hit you a lot harder than others. And every time you experience one situation, it's going to get easier. So the first time you experience CPR and you experience death, it's going to be a lot easier the second time that you see it too. So being nice to yourself goes hand in hand with getting out of your head and doing something for you. Number 4, connect with the right network and your network outside of work, or the right people that you can also talk to. So 2 examples of this, and even though it's sort of similar to the one earlier, what's different is that sometimes it is really helpful to talk to people that maybe are in healthcare, but they're just not at your facility. So for instance, I am so blessed to have so many nurse friends all over the country. And so I still talk to them sometimes about situations when I go out to dinner, or I go finally let loose and maybe go to happy hour, maybe have girls' night, and I'm around these other nurses. It just feels so good to vent off, talk about these situations, laugh about them, do all kinds of things that you're connecting with the right people, and it doesn't have to be the people you're around. And part 2 of this is that sometimes it is really good to connect with people maybe that you're not even so close to in your same unit. So a very big example of this is when my hospital at the time was having a tremendous amount of trauma coming in the door. And there was kind of this like gloom and doom feeling I was feeling, where it was just this black cloud lingering, because in a matter of 3 weeks, I can't even tell you how many people I experienced that had unfortunately passed away. This is before COVID times, and even though we were so used to so much trauma and constantly seeing it, this was a very odd month of certain things going down. And so when that happened, I really started to kind of second guess and think like, well, what is the point? I don't understand even what the point is anymore. I mean, we live this life and then this happens and then, things happen and you just kind of die. And it put me in a very negative space. And the thing that was helpful is I went to 2 of the most veteran nurses that I knew that have been there 20, 30 years. And I said to them like, hey man, I'm kind of struggling. I feel just very confused about life and the fact that we're just seeing so much death. And it was so hard for me to like understand. And I felt that numbness of emotions. It was like, it wasn't happy, but I also wasn't sad. I didn't know how to process. And going to them, hearing that they experience the same things, and just how we have to remember that what we see is a very small percentage of reality. If you think of the population that at this particular hospital is serving, there are 5, 6, 7 million people in this city, and we were seeing like the 1% of bad stuff that's coming in that door. It's like you can get lost in the reality of what life is whenever you're experiencing so much of it. So having the people outside of your facility is definitely important, having those friends and family, but then also going to those people in the unit that you feel comfortable with, no matter what shape or form. And usually the most experienced people on the floor are people that are really helpful to go to, because they will have some really interesting insight about the circle of life and how this is something that does happen, unfortunately, but how you can also, handle it. And if there's one specific situation that did happen, it's sometimes really good to go to those people and kind of re-talk about again, to just talk about what could have been better, what could have not. And oftentimes we hear this as debriefing. And from my own personal experience, a lot of facilities never debrief. There has been a few situations where the doctors have called the debriefing, and a lot of times that's been because of something very odd and unique that has happened in that traumatic moment. Sometimes it's really great when one of the surgeons came and started to debrief us, because we ended up calling something a little sooner than we were all used to. But that was truly because we didn't understand what they saw, and we didn't understand the situation around it. But I wouldn't have gotten that clarity unless we would have actually had that debrief. But I wouldn't have that clarity if I didn't talk to somebody that was actually in the situation with me, that saw what was going on. So having your support outside, having that support in your own unit, and reaching out to them. And don't be afraid to, because when we are vulnerable with people, it creates really great emotional connections as well. So you might just make a really good friend out of it. And lastly, number 5, which is my ultimate favorite one, is cognitive reframing. Cognitive reframing is changing the way you perceive a situation. So instead of focusing on the negative part of the trauma or the situation that you're seeing, you're now either focusing on the neutral stuff or focusing on the positive aspects. So instead of thinking about how a patient slipped in the shower and ended up hitting their head and now has a massive bleed and you're totally unsure if they're gonna make it or not, thinking about the positive aspects of that. And although that sounds very odd, the positives can be something like, you have now been equipped with the knowledge to see what it's like at that level of somebody hitting their head, and if they have that bleed, when they came in the door, what they presented. But what else are you doing? What are you implementing to help that bleed? Were you a part of giving either like a mannitol or lowering their pressure, or being there if they end up needing to get a bolt put in? Did you get to see that? Did you get to experience it? What are those things that are going to basically help further your knowledge? And focusing most importantly on the fact that you were able to be there for their care. So it's super unfortunate that the patient went through it, but all of that work that you put in and all of the training, you were finally able to utilize your skills to be there for that person. That can be even on med surg floors. You are seeing things that are just beyond, and spending so much time with that patient, and you might have made that emotional connection with that family, and based on around the situation that the patient has. And as hurtful as that can be, thinking about the positivity of the fact that you were there when that person was going through chemo, when that person was going through whatever it is, the impact that you were able to have. Sure, we can't be so naive and think that we can always change a life, but we can be the people there to plant little seeds and make things a little easier or better. And so all that training that you did, you are now there able to provide that service. So Cognitive reframing is one of my favorite. It's not avoiding the problem, don't get that mistake. It is just getting a way to think of the goodness. And that is being very optimistic, and that is a big part of my nature, but it's something that's going to really do you a service, and just remember that you were able to be there for them. I hope you guys like these strategies. Please leave in the comment section anything that might help you. And if there's anything that you do that helps you get through that secondary trauma, please subscribe. If you like watching this, we have a bunch of educational shorts too as well that go over hard medical concepts. I hope you guys have a great shift, and I'll see you in the next one.